So in our book study this summer, this guy Paul Loeb is basically writing about the fundamental things that keep us from getting involved as agents for good in our communities. One of those things he says is the fact that we look at ourselves and then we look at other people who have made a difference, or we look at what we can do and then see the problems of the world, and there's this huge gap in between those things. And this chapter in his book was focused on the notion that every great thing that's ever happened in the world and every seemingly superhuman person that we've met started with a little step. You've heard this before. But when I read the book, I actually got discouraged because in the context of what he wrote, he phrased all of these little steps in terms of what great, huge thing I might accomplish. He would say, well, didn't you know the person who organized the last presidential campaign for this candidate began by registering to vote? Didn't you know the person who single-handedly overturned unjust legislation started with one book that they read? And it made me think, is the reason that we make these little steps and changes in our lives because if you register to vote, you might be the mayor of your city one day? Or is it that those things actually make a difference? And I found myself, and I didn't make the connection until I was sitting here this morning with Father's Day, thinking about what it means to learn to look at people in our lives that are unfinished, and a world that is not yet where I want it to be, and a self that is not yet where I want him to be, and respond with love. In the book, Paul Loeb describes these little moments in our life as baby steps. He says that what we're supposed to do is look at an infant child who is learning to walk and learn from their wisdom, and he makes it seem like this noble, pure endeavor where a child knows exactly what they're doing and sets out step by step, and he says, look at the child, they're undaunted by failure and frustration. They don't even seem to notice. Yeah, right. Walk. That's not how it goes. And in fact, one of the privileges of being a minister, and if you go to seminary you get to do this, is on Father's Day, show a video of your son walking for the first time. I happen to have that. So, yes, more of that. Thank you, please. Yes. Point being, there's a couple of things I noticed there after reading his book. So that's the first time I ever saw him take more than a couple of steps. So he cries about halfway through, and he doesn't seem to really know what's happening. And I can tell you the only reason that he kept going is because I was in front of him with my iPhone going like this and trying to get him to follow me back. His feet were moving without him having any idea. He wasn't single-handedly in a pure fashion overcoming his frustration. It was hard. He had no idea where he was going to end up, and if you look at his shins and forehead, there's the result of many, many failures in this endeavor. What I look and ask myself is, being unfinished is part of what makes him lovable, right? It's part of his charm. I look at this child and I delight in the next word that he learns. Taking 7 steps instead of 5 was a huge deal. I watch him recognize an animal or an animal sound that I didn't know he knew, and I freak out with delight at these small little changes in his development. It's part of what makes him who he is. And yet at some point in my life, being unfinished became a problem for me. I stopped looking at myself and others and delighting in all of the beautiful small accomplishments and things that they learned. And I find that at some point, being unfinished was part of what made me so lovable and charming in the eyes of someone. And now what makes me really hard to live with. At what point do the scales tip and we begin to see more of what's missing from our lives than what's present? I am practiced in this skill. I have honed this ability to see the missing pieces and all that I am not yet and all that you are not yet or the world is not yet, because I do it every day. And it causes me to respond to an unfinished world and unfinished people and the unfinished man that I see looking back at me in the mirror and have my initial reaction be judgment. Sometimes this shows up in really practical ways that I'm certain you can identify with. I rarely know how many times I succeeded in getting the laundry done in a week. But I know how many loads are on the floor. I know how many pounds I didn't gain or lose, and I know how many times I didn't go to the gym, and a million other practical tallies that I keep going in my head all the time. I know that this also applies to my spiritual life and my attempts to become a better human being, where I look back over a week or a year or a decade and ask, have we seen any change here? I'm engaged in trying to follow the practice of right speech in the Buddhist tradition, which is asking before I say something, is it true? Is it necessary? Is it kind? I know exactly how many days last week I didn't get until 9:30 before I broke this promise. 7. But I don't remember how many times I followed through. I know how easy it is in my life to see the human I am and the human I want to be and see this tremendous gap. And it translates into how I identify with other human beings, too. There are some people and organizations and groups that make astounding steps forward in their efforts to do good and be good in the world, and all I can see is what they haven't done. The Pope came out as a universalist. A couple of weeks ago, he said publicly that everybody, non-Christians, atheists even, he said, can be redeemed and live with God in the promise of heaven. And you know what I thought? Almost immediately, well, yeah, that's great, but you still haven't moved forward the Catholic Church with GLBT rights. It didn't take a second in my mind for me to dismiss this huge moment because I knew what was missing. The Boy Scouts in the last couple of weeks made a huge step forward in affirming the full dignity and rights of gay scouts to enter into their fellowship, and I did the same thing. Well, yeah, but I realize that in these moments, whether it's the church across the street or a family member or a famous person, what I'm doing is seeing what's missing and knowing what would fix them, and knowing what would fix them usually looks like them becoming more like me. Strangely enough, right? The funny thing about that is that the faith that we teach and preach and try to follow here says that that's absolutely not the case. Our Unitarian ancestors talked about spiritual development being something that happened over the course of your entire life. They didn't have this single moment of salvation. They called it salvation through character. Doesn't that sound appealing? The Universalist ancestors on the other side of our history had in their minds a God who did not need to change anything about you before it would offer you love. In fact, you didn't get a choice. The God of the Universalists said, I love you, and there's nothing you can do about it. And the science of evolution that we hold so dear in our big story teaches that every single thing in the universe is unfinished. I saw a cartoon this week. I don't know if you can read this, but we have tiny mammals and bigger mammals and bigger mammals, and then this person, and the people on the lower rungs say to him, I was wondering when you would notice there's a lot more steps. The story is so much bigger than us. There may be intelligent creatures walking on the face of this earth that look nothing like us. And yet I've come to believe that the world will only be right when it looks like the world that I want to see. And that the people in my life will be fixed and whole and good when they become like I want them to be, which is usually more like me, which is impossible because I know me and I can't even do it. One thing I've discovered that I know for sure is that it is absolutely impossible to love what is missing. That it is absolutely impossible to love the infinity of who your partner is not yet because it's huge. You can't hold on to it. It's impossible to see the infinity of who I am not yet and to love that person. In both of our readings this morning, both a famous ethicist and theologian and a local Baptist preacher come to the same conclusion. Taking the long view with human beings, they said, leads us to grace. Now, they didn't talk about the grace of some God up in the heavens. We settled that question in our tradition a long time ago. They were talking about us. They said that we are called to grace. Easier said than done. The long view, which I believe in, really doesn't make me feel all that much better. Sure, we're overdeveloping the land, but in 1 billion years, we'll all be dead anyway, and the trees will take back over. Sure, Nelson Mandela came about because billions of years ago, an explosion of hydrogen gas so massive that it created the entire universe spun and whirled into millions of pieces, which became you and me and him. And it took billions of years for him to come about. But I don't have that long. And I know that I look at the world and I don't see its progress, and I look at myself and I don't see my progress. And I wonder that if we did, if we wouldn't be a little more gentle with the human beings that we encounter. If each one of us walked around with a scorecard hanging around our necks that showed all of the thousands of things that went right today. Or if each one of us walked around with a sign on our backs or something on the front of our shirts that said the kind of things we're struggling and working on. Give me a break, I'm trying to drink less. Take it easy on me, I'm trying to see my children more. Trying to be more patient. Trying to be less judgmental. If we wore those signs around our necks, I wonder what we would see in this room. Every person in this room is carrying with them some sort of struggle that they're not feeling progress on. And one of the gifts that we can give to the people in our lives is to be the kind of person who looks at what is not yet finished and still knows that it's good. That, I think, is grace, which is kind of a funny word because it implies that someone's broken or undeserving and then gets this gift. But I think what it is the call to practice responding to things that are unfinished and honoring what is before we start condemning what's missing. And that's such a hard pattern to get out of. I think there are some indicators in our life that we need to practice grace more often. If you find that you're using the words always and never a lot, you might need to practice grace. He always, she never, they always. If you find that the last 5 churches you were a part of could never do you right, or the last 5 schools, or the last 5 partners, or the last 5 places you went this week seemed to be filled with incompetent people who didn't care and didn't do their jobs well, but I really could have fixed the place up had they listened to me. I've said that 1,000,000 times. Chances are we've fallen into that pattern of so easily seeing what's missing before we honor what's good. This week in our congregation, a man named Larry James came and visited us and talked to us about poverty in Dallas and what we could do. And I thought he did a tremendous job at tying personal experiences of grace with justice. He pointed to moments when it was there and moments when it wasn't. He talked about one of the first experiences he saw when his organization's city square was just a food bank. He said one day there was a woman at the welcome counter checking people in and seeing what they needed, and Willie Nelson came in and came to the front and registered to get some food. We said he might as well have been Willie Nelson. He had a long ponytail, and his face was kind of weathered, and he looked like he had had an interesting life. Well, the man is signing up to get his food, and the woman who's checking him in looks and sees a pack of cigarettes hanging in his front pocket. And she says to him, and he said he'll never forget this, "Well, you wouldn't have to come here and get our food if you just stopped smoking those nasty old cigarettes." She did what I do so well. She looked at a full human being in front of her and saw what she believed to be missing. He described a better version of the story, which is a man that he knew had come in seeking to get some assistance because he'd just been released from prison. He was the kind of guy who other people crossed the street when they saw him coming, he said. When he came in, he later admitted to Larry that his first day there, he was looking for what he could steal so that he could sell it and fuel his cocaine habit. When he got there, he stuck around all day, and he was kind of wandering in and out of the stacks of food. And he said that the woman at the counter, a different woman, said, "Would you come back tomorrow?" It's just a few words, right? He said no one had ever asked him to come back anywhere. That this was a tremendous thing. This moment of redemption, of grace, of wholeness, turned him into one of the best volunteers and then best employees and then one of the best human beings that Larry James, he said, he had ever known. We get so practiced in seeing what's missing in ourselves. Sometimes I think that the practice of grace means understanding when we're in that place of judgment and naming it and trying not to judge that judgment. And then to stop and pause and ask ourselves if what we see before us has good in it. A Buddhist teacher that I listen to regularly named Tara Brach says that in these moments where we find ourselves in this pattern of judgment over and over, to simply place a hand on our heart and say, "Forgiven." Or to silently place our hand on our heart and look at the human being in front of us that we know how to change and say in our minds, "Unfinished." And to respond with love. The problems in the world that face our congregation are overwhelming. And often the pace of change in a church can be grindingly slow. I know that the pace of change in my life seems to go that slow too. But I look at this congregation and see a tremendous amount of resources to build good, both in your personal lives and in our city. What would you say if I came to you and said, "I have an offer. I would like to give you a city square block in some of the prime real estate in the country. And then what I'm going to do is put 2 huge buildings that function to do whatever you want to do in them. I'm going to give you 1,200 people who call themselves active participants and members of this organization. They will contribute with their finances and time and spirit, and thousands of other people will come. On an average Sunday, I'm going to give you 600 adults and 200 children intent on building a better world. Would you like that?" If someone came up to you and said, "Would you like me to provide that for you?" you'd say, "Of course." And that's what we have. That's what this is. And that's who you are. We can be practiced in a lot of things. Distancing ourselves from others, seeing what's missing, fixing ourselves or others. But I think one of the challenges that will be our primary focus in a life of spirit is how to learn practicing looking at a world that's unfinished and people that are unfinished and the person in the mirror who's unfinished and knowing that it's good. and it is, and you are. And amen.